Another set of spoilers from the upcoming Legends of Runeterra expansion have been revealed, this time focusing on the Noxus region. We've got another brand new champion being added to the game, along with some more cards spoiled that support said champion. In this video, we'll be covering the 4th champion revealed from the next set, Swain, as well as the other new cards revealed. Just like in previous videos, we'll be talking about what Swain does along with the other spoilers shown, and I'll also be giving some initial thoughts on the types of decks Swain and the other spoilers will likely fit best in. Let's jump right into it. We'll start off with the man of the hour, Swain. Swain is a 5-mana champion from the Noxus region. He has 3 power and 6 health at level 1. He has Fearsome, and when he strikes the enemy Nexus in combat, he deals 3 additional damage to it. In order for Swain to level up, you must deal a total of 12 non-combat damage to anything during the game. When Swain levels up, he has 4 power and 7 health, keeps Fearsome, and when any non-combat damage is dealt to the enemy Nexus, you stun the strongest enemy your opponent has on their back row, or what some of us have been calling their bench up until now. Just as a quick recap, strongest means the enemy with the highest power. In addition, his Nexus Strike ability now deals 3 damage to all enemies, instead of an additional 3 damage to the Nexus. Swain looks like a very, very flexible champion to me. Similar to Sejuani when she was revealed about a week ago now. My initial thoughts are that Swain can fit in both aggro and mid-range decks, but each archetype will have slightly different ways of utilizing Swain. If you're playing Noxus aggro, you can play Swain at the top of your mana curve, but your deck doesn't actually need Swain to level up. You can keep Swain at level 1 since dealing damage to the enemy Nexus is what's most important in aggro decks. Not so much dealing 3 damage to everything, which is just icing on the cake. This seems like a solid option for burn decks that don't mind losing a tiny bit of speed to run a 5-mana unit. I can also see Swain being used in a mid-range deck that focuses on getting Swain to level 2. But this might be a bit harder to pull off. Most regions don't have ways of dealing damage outside of combat. In fact, the only regions that have the most cards that deal damage are Noxus, Piltover and Zaun, and to a lesser extent Shadow Isles. Freljord does have Avalanche, and while it does sound good to pair with Swain, I think in practice it won't work out. The only scenarios where Avalanche will level up your Swain quickly are against aggro, and you also have to have some semblance of a board when you play it. I just think even with the new Freljord cards that were spoiled and the new Noxus cards we'll be talking about later, pairing Freljord with Swain is going to be a little too awkward. Unless we're getting more damage-based cards in this set other than what's been revealed today, this mid-range deck will likely be Noxus paired with Piltover and Zaun. Thermogenic Beam should be able to go a long way to leveling up your Swain. As far as what's considered non-combat damage, there is a little bit of confusion when it comes to some less obvious cards. Initially, I was told that literally any damage that isn't considered a strike in any phase counts as non-combat damage, which would confirm that something like Boom Crew Rookie actually counts, despite needing to go into combat in order to deal damage with his ability. That would also mean cards like Single Combat and Whirling Death would not count because they cause your units to strike other units, even in the case of single combat where you can technically use it outside of the actual combat phase. But then later, the same source said Single Combat and Whirling Death would count as non-combat damage, even though you have to use Whirling Death on an ally in combat and choose an enemy that's also in combat to strike. So I'm not sure on whether or not these cards count towards Swain's level up. As far as what's considered combat damage, it's going to come down to whether or not it strikes in any phase, strikes in the combat phase only, or any damage dealt during the combat phase, whether that damage is a strike or not. We'll need to do some testing once the set releases. The only other concern about Swain in general is that he comes online around the time where Fearsome can start to fall off in effectiveness. Most decks will usually have something with 3 power around to block Swain with by the mid game. This is probably less of a concern for the aggro decks that might run Swain, just because those decks will put so much pressure on the opponent that Swain getting blocked likely won't matter. This will more often hurt the mid-range decks that want to get Swain to level 2. Now, let's get into the other cards that were revealed with Swain, starting with Ravenous Flock. This is a 1 mana fast spell that deals 4 damage to a unit if it's damaged or stunned. So this seems like a decent card. I could see it being played in decks like Noxus Ezreal that run Noxian Guillotine, and this card would function as additional copies of Noxian Guillotine. It doesn't outright kill the unit, but a lot of things die to 5 damage in this game, so it might be able to do a decent impression. Barrier and pump spells can still mess with this though, unlike Guillotine, which doesn't care how big something is as long as it's damaged. A deck that could possibly make better use of Ravenous Flock though is Yasuo. Usually when you're playing Yasuo, you're running quite a few stun cards to get him to level up as soon as possible. Far more than recall cards anyway. I'm pretty sure Ravenous Flock will see play somewhere as long as slower Noxus decks stay relevant. Maybe Noxus aggro decks would use a card like this just because it's cheap, but usually you want your damage to be flexible in Noxus aggro, meaning you want damage spells to be able to hit the Nexus too, not just units. So I don't think we'll see Ravenous Flock in the meta if Noxus aggro is the only Noxus deck being played in set 2. Let's talk about Noxian Fervor next. This is a 3 mana fast spell that deals 3 damage to an allied unit to deal 3 damage to anything else. I think this card has some potential, especially when combined with Swain, but outside of slower Swain decks, it feels a bit underpowered right now. Its best use is being used defensively when your opponent targets a unit with removal, similar to Glimpse Beyond, but 3 mana is a bit too much for this type of effect. I also think your unit taking 3 damage is a bit too much if you ever want to use this card proactively, and while that isn't the best use for this card, the 3 damage does limit this card's flexibility. Even Noxus decks that run high health units like Vladimir decks don't want their units taking 3 damage. So you're basically forced to play this card in response to your opponent's action and nowhere else. Unless we're getting more high health Noxus units, I just have a feeling this card is going to need a buff for it to truly see use. Slower Swain decks will be the only decks likely to play this card, in my opinion. Next, let's talk about Imperial Demolitionist. This is a 2 mana follower with 2 power and 3 health, and when you play it, you deal 1 damage to an ally to deal 2 damage to the enemy Nexus. So this is a solid 2 mana follower for Swain decks, whether you're actually trying to level Swain up or not. Keep in mind this ability has a skill icon next to it, meaning that your opponent can respond to you playing this card. But I think that will rarely come up, especially during the early game when this is going to be played. Your opponent won't have the mana to respond to this ability outside of something like Get Excited. And even in the late game, they may not want to use an actual card to respond to an ability like this that may or may not be impactful depending on the situation. If they do have to use a card, they won't be happy about it. Anyway, of all the cards spoiled today, I expect to see this card in every Swain deck paired with Crimson Disciple. A 2/3 is just a solid stat line for a 2 mana follower. The deck I don't expect to see this card in is Vladimir decks. It sounds good in theory, but I think Vladimir decks make better use of the +2 power that Crimson Aristocrat grants one of your units than the 2 damage to the enemy Nexus from this card. Aristocrat's ability can't be responded to either, by the way. Next, we've got Citybreaker that was revealed. This is a 4 mana follower with 0 power and 5 health, and at the start of every round, it deals 1 damage to the enemy Nexus. This card I'm not sold on. I think it's actually the worst card of the bunch that were spoiled today. The idea behind this card seems to be to get Nexus damage in order to level up Swain or even Sejuani over time, but I think it's just a bit too slow for either champion to utilize. That and a 0/5 stat line for a 4-cost follower in a game that's proven that you really need your 4 mana follower to have a big impact on the board is not attractive at all. It doesn't help you fight for control of the board, and it even dies to another Noxus card, Culling Strike. I'm not expecting this card to see serious play, and will be very surprised if it does. Finally, we have the Leviathan. This is an 8 mana follower with 5 power and 8 health. It has Overwhelm, and when you play the Leviathan, you draw a copy of Swain from your deck. This also deals 1 damage to the enemy Nexus 3 times at the start of each round. Noxus is getting its second effect that tutors for champions, the first being Draven's Biggest Fan. You could say this is actually the first tutor for Noxus, since Draven's Biggest Fan doesn't actually put Draven into your hand like this does for Swain. Anyway, it seems like this card is meant to level up Swain quickly if you haven't done so by round 8 yet, especially given its round start ability. It does have an immediate effect, which is good. It has high health, which is also good. But even with all the stuff this card has going on, I'm not sure if it's enough to see play in mid-range Swain decks. 8 mana is just a lot to pay for any card in general, unless it's something like Tryndamere, because even if your opponent spends removal on Tryndamere, he doesn't actually die in most cases. He'll just level up instead. Unlike Tryndamere, this card does get removed by something like Vengeance. The good thing is, it doesn't get removed by much else. 8 health is a lot, though 5 power is a bit middling for an Overwhelm unit on round 8. If this sees play in Ranked, I expect players to only run 1 copy of this card in their Swain decks. Otherwise, they'll probably be able to function without this card. That's all I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to like the video below or even share it with others. Both help to get the video out there to others in the community here on YouTube. I'll be looking to cover more of the new cards as they're spoiled over the next few weeks, so if you don't want to miss those videos or any other videos I put out, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell icon. And feel free to follow me at the other social media places I hang out. You can catch me streaming Runeterra live on Twitch, as well as hanging out on Twitter and even my own Discord. Links to all of those are in the video description. Thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you next time. Take care.